I think a lot of people, when they hear the word circular economy, think about a model that's trying to reduce waste and increase recycling. A lot of people sort of simplify it to that type of narrative. But actually, for us, the circular economy has always been a way of thinking about systems and system solutions.
And the challenge really that companies have is to create the business model of tomorrow while still operating the business model of today, and to then manage that transition from one to the other.
Welcome back to Net Zero, What's Innovation Got to Do with It? The podcast where we explore one of the critical ingredients for decarbonising our economies at breakneck speed, innovation. I'm Simon Retallick.
And I'm Nina Foster, and together we lead the Carbon Trust's Net Zero Intelligence Unit. So far in the series, we've covered why innovation is so important in the face of an urgent crisis, and also why we need to deploy innovation to rapidly scale up existing climate solutions. What will we be exploring in today's episode, Simon?
Well, one phrase that's often used when talking about addressing the climate crisis is no more business as usual. And that's what we'll be exploring today in our third episode, innovating to transform the way we do business.
And more companies than ever are setting net zero targets. But as they work towards those targets, many businesses will be confronted with an uncomfortable reality that their business model is fundamentally incompatible with a net zero world.
That's right. Many business models rely on patterns of production and consumption that the planet simply can't keep up with, and for which technological innovation alone cannot provide the answer. To reach net zero, we'll need innovative new business models which embrace different ways of designing, producing, and using products and services.
To help us explore how all of this is possible, we have two fantastic guests joining us today. We have Andrew Morlet, Chief Executive Officer at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the leading voice on circular business models, and Aleyn Smith-Gillespie, who leads the Carbon Trust's work on the circular economy and business model innovation. Welcome, Andrew and Aleyn.
Thanks, Nina. Thanks, Simon. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having me.
A good place for us to start is to explore why companies need to rethink their business models in the first place and what the alternatives to business as usual might be. Andrew, clearly the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is well known for inspiring businesses and other organisations to reinvent themselves, which is no easy feat. Why, after a career at McKinsey and other well-known consulting firms, you decide to give all that up and try to throw yourself into addressing this thorny challenge?
Well, I think the interesting thing for me through my career was really observing the relentless drive for year-on-year growth with models that were essentially extractive economic models. They really were relying on the use of finite materials that were essentially discarded and taken out of the economy in very short order. And it always struck me that was really quite a challenging model to maintain over a long period of time. And, I got to the point in my career where I felt that I had learned an extraordinary amount by participating in that transformation through my career and really recognizing the planetary limits and the extraordinary amount of waste. I felt that it was an interesting opportunity for me to apply what I'd learned to a different direction, which was really towards an economy that could run in the long term by really transforming itself to eliminate waste and pollution, keep materials in use, and regenerate natural systems.
Thanks very much for that. We look forward to diving into some of the topics that you raised there. But before we do, Aleyn, I'm going to turn to you. Obviously, we know that businesses are critical to determining whether or not we reach net zero. After all, they make or sell most of the products which cause emissions. Could you explain, though, why business model innovation is essential for achieving net zero?
Yes, well, in order to match the scale of global emissions reduction that needs to happen, companies effectively have to more or less halve the emissions that they currently have. And by 2030 and to keep on driving that down over the following decade. So the scale of change that's needed really requires a substantial rethinking of how a company manufactures, produces, sells products. And all that at the core will require a decoupling of a company's activities or our economic activities from environmental impact, from carbon emissions, whilst at the same time ensuring that we still have thriving economies and societies. So that really requires a substantial rethink. And at the core of this issue, I think, is having a specific design intent around the products and services that a company manufactures, how they're sold, how they're used, the business model itself, and also the wider system change. And irregardless, all companies will need to be part of that wider change.
And Aleyn, there, you just talked about the importance of decoupling the business model from resource intensity. And that, of course, touches on circular economic models. And that's really what we want to zero in on today, is the ability of businesses to transform into circular businesses. So, Andrew, if I could come to you on this as a leading voice in the field, can you explain what the circular economy is and how that relates to business model innovation?
Sure. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word circular economy, think about a model that's trying to reduce waste and increase recycling. A lot of people sort of simplify it to that type of narrative. But actually, for us, the circular economy has always been a way of thinking about systems and system solutions. And what we're essentially promoting is the idea of the circular economy as a framework for system solutions that really are based on three fundamental principles. The first one is to eliminate materials that are not necessary to be added into the economy, and to eliminate toxic materials and problematic materials from the economy, to essentially reduce the unnecessary materials. The second is to circulate, which is to keep the materials that we do need in the economy for longer at their highest value for as long as possible, at their highest utilization. So that includes all of the things all the levers that would keep materials in the economy, such as reuse, repair, remanufacturing, recycling ultimately. But, all of those things that I mentioned before, and they, if you think about reuse and remanufacturing, they require a collaboration across the value chain to get products back after they've been used and to be able to repair them, remanufacture them, and keep them in use longer. And the third principle is about regenerating natural systems. And this is super important because a lot of people, again, think of the circular economy as really only relating to technical materials and how they're used in the economy. But what we're promoting is this idea of technical materials and the biosphere, or the technosphere and the biosphere. And that if we keep materials in use for longer at their highest value, we lower the demand for new raw materials. So we leave space for nature in that way. But we also lower the demand for energy in the system. That is, that we're actually maximizing the return on invested energy that we put into those materials and products in the first place. So we make space for nature on the one hand, but then we want to actually design into the economy nature positive intent. So again, it's eliminate, circulate, regenerate, and all by design. So it's not how we deal with things after they've been used, but how we design this intention into the system from the get-go.
What are some of the most exciting or even unexpected examples that you've seen of businesses actually transforming into circular ones?
Well, I think there's sort of two ways to think about this. There's the smaller startup innovators who are developing new product, service, system solutions, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of these, and they range across a very broad field because, what we're talking about is pretty much every sector in the economy having an opportunity to apply this thinking. So that ranges from, washing machines and refrigerators in your house to the plastics packaging that you get your food in, the food itself and how that's grown, the cars you drive, the buildings you live in. So it's, the clothing you wear. If you think about the topic of clothing and fashion, the potential for changing business models from one where you buy very cheap clothing that you use once or twice, they sit in your wardrobe for ages, and then you throw them away effectively. This is the fast fashion sort of disposability of clothing has grown hugely over the last several years, such that at the moment, there's a dump truck of clothing going into landfill or incineration every single second. So it's a staggering amount of waste. And we found in plastics and in fashion that the extent to which we are keeping those materials, the cotton, the polyesters, the plastics packaging, the extent to which we're keeping them in the system is really, really low. So you've seen the innovation in fashion where you've got reuse models and resale models emerging, and there's a number of these that companies like Rent the Runway, who have become what's referred to as a unicorn in terms of being $1 billion business in very short order, and there's several of those. There's others, around plastics packaging that are fairly prominent at the moment. There's a company called Nopla, which uses seaweed for as an alternative for creating packaging. And you can eat it, you can coat paper with it, so it takes plastics right out of the equation. So there are lots of examples in startups, but we're also seeing, interestingly, the major companies, the major food manufacturers, the major packaging manufacturers innovating and spending literally billions of dollars on innovation and new systems for circularity. So you've got both ends of the big players and the small players. I think it's super interesting, that mix, because big companies often struggle with the innovation and adoption of those ideas, whereas the small companies can move very nimbly and grow very quickly. And I think we're getting the balance of both, the ability to potentially acquire or to learn from the startups and then take those into very big businesses who can then scale it globally is really, really quite fascinating.
Clearly, the benefits are there from an energy point of view, climate point of view, broader sustainability point of view of a circular economy. But what's in it for individual companies? What are the sorts of benefits that you've seen circularity bring at a sort of company level that means there's a powerful business case for them to do this?
Over the last 10 years or so, we've seen a variety of really quite interesting business cases and business rationales for this thinking. If you looked at Renault probably 7 or 8 years ago, maybe even a little longer, maybe 10, when we had a spike in steel prices globally, what they were doing was looking at the remanufacturing of their motors, their engines in France, in a factory in Choisy. And this was essentially taking an engine block, and instead of trashing it or scrapping it and then recycling it, that is, expending a huge amount of energy to melt the metal and turn it back into a casted block, they were remanufacturing the engines. So they were essentially taking a used engine, they were replacing any parts that needed to be replaced in it, but retaining the vast majority of it in its original form. So radically reducing the amount of material inputs, energy inputs, water use, etc. And at the time, that was one of the most profitable parts of Renault's business. Its remanufacturing was, extraordinarily profitable. And you see companies like Caterpillar, John Deere, many of the industrial players in the mining space and heavy equipment use remanufacturing as an example, and it's extremely profitable. That's an interesting example. But there are numerous other ones where we're seeing companies who are trying to essentially de-risk their value chains by establishing more integrated relationships across their value chains. So COVID really woke up a lot of companies and about their supply chain risks and the international trade risks, etc. So you're seeing companies sort of rethinking their value chains and their relationships with their suppliers. And this is quite interesting as well, because if you are able to get change the business models where you're instead of just purchasing your raw materials on a commodity basis, you're thinking about them in terms of the long-term resilience of your supply chain. So a good example is in the food space, with companies who are now investing much more closely with their farmers and sort of working out how they can ensure that they've got more regenerative food production that is more viable in the longer term, more resilient to climate change, and more resilient in terms of creating community value.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, you've just outlined so many reasons why a business might start rethinking its business model in this direction, not just for the good of the climate, but also thinking ahead to their own long-term value creation as well. And some great examples of sectors in terms of fashion and consumer electronics. Aleyn, I wonder what you think of those sectors that Andrew has picked up on. Do you think those are the sectors that are most ripe for the circular economy, or are there any others that you think are really well positioned for this kind of innovation?
Well, I share Andrew's view that all sectors have the potential to tremendously benefit from this type of business model change, and finding better ways to create value and to give value to end customers is a really big part of the case of doing so. But to add to some of the sectors that Andrew mentioned, those we may not think of necessarily as also having challenges for improving resource efficiency or decarbonizing are, for example, the renewable sector. So the renewable sector is absolutely essential for decarbonizing the rest of us, of what we need to do. But this huge shift that we're going to see from, and we need to see, from fossil fuel to renewables will be basically shifting resource intensity from fossil fuels, but still towards materials. Of course, you need a lot of materials, a wide variety of materials, many of which are environmentally sensitive or create environmental damage upstream, as Andrew was mentioning, in the supply chains. So whether it's batteries or wind or solar, and of course, what will happen to these things at the end of their life? If we're rolling out reams of solar panels around the world, what will happen to that at the end of life? Or batteries, for example, the chemicals in there. So we are seeing increasingly now companies who are starting from a design mindset from the very beginning. They're designing in a better business model to ensure that they have more custody, ownership, or visibility of their products throughout their life. And we have programs with a number of companies in these different sectors, and they're now becoming more conscious of that fact.
The oil and gas sector, clearly critical in all of this. Is circularity appropriate for them? Are there limits to the circularity model when it comes to oil and gas, do you think?
It's going to take a while, but it's pretty clear that we need to get away from burning things if we're going to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. What we have done over the years is to really promote the industrial and business innovation agenda, because that is where the solutions are really going to come from. But you've got to make the distinction between the companies and the businesses that are investing heavily and trying really hard to find innovative solutions, from the others who are not, who are just simply biding their time and maximizing their profits through the extractive cycle. And we have to get policy aligned towards the front-running innovators to help them to be able to move further and faster. And we need to level the playing field and start to raise the bar for the laggards. And I think there's lots of examples now where we can really see the front-running businesses, whether they're whichever sector they're in. There are leading examples where companies are innovating their business models, their product service systems, investing hugely in doing that, and they need regulatory help to be able to do that more, and they need the economics to work through the leveling of the playing field, because you can't have companies who are investing in very, very significant transformations being penalized because they're not able to match the economics of the extractors, the people who are not doing that.
Andrew, thanks a lot. You touched on the role of government there. I think it's probably a good point to pivot to that. I know that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation set out 5 universal policy goals for enabling circularity. Can you outline what those are for us, please?
The first one was really this point around stimulating design for circular economy. That's essentially the point of saying this is not a waste and recycling issue alone. It's about stimulating design of solutions. And that takes many forms, the way in which we educate, in education, how we orient new engineers and designers to this topic, how we can stimulate innovation and research and innovation through government expenditure. So it's policy and regulation, but it's all about shifting the focus to the redesign of product, service, system solutions aligned with the principles I mentioned. The second goal is really around making the economics work. And this is the point I was making earlier about ensuring that we are, through policy and regulation, favouring the regenerative circular solutions in a way that allows companies to innovate in that space and not be disadvantaged. The other one is around investment for infrastructure and for innovation and for learning, for skills. So we should be, governments should be investing specifically in those things. The other one is around establishing collaborations between public and private sector. So as I said, a lot of the innovation is and must come from private sector, but it needs to be done in consultation. It needs to inform policy in a way that policy can keep up with and actually align towards. The other one was about managing resources to preserve value, which is, again, to put policy and regulatory incentives in place for things like reuse, repair, remanufacturing, resale, etc. So those are the 5. So stimulate design, make the economics work, invest in infrastructure and innovation skills, collaborate for systems change, and manage resources to preserve their value.
You've just outlined there, quite how many different actors are involved in this transformation. Could you give us an example of a time that you've brought industry players and governments and any others together to create that enabling environment for circular economic models?
Yeah, I think a really good example is what we've been working on in the plastic space over now many years. What we did was we created an initiative called the Global Commitment. We originally had a group of around 10 companies that came together around this topic and said, we need to create a set of definitions, a vision, a reporting mechanism, a program office for sharing information and learning into a challenge. And we created the Global Commitment, which was set off in 2017. We've just done a report on the effectiveness of that voluntary commitment by leading companies. As I said, we started with a small group. It grew to well over 1,000 participants. And what they did was they deliberately set an audacious and somewhat unreasonably ambitious objective that by 2025 they would only place on market recyclable, compostable, or reusable packaging. And an important thing there was, you had to have the definition of what each of those things meant. So there's a working definition established and a timeline and measurement, etc. So they've made huge progress on this over the years. But what's really interesting about it is that you've got innovation within the actors themselves who in 5 years have taken off market around 3 million tons of virgin plastics, the signatories of the commitment, which essentially equates the entire plastics packaging of the United Kingdom off market annually, in perpetuity. that equates to around 1 barrel of oil remaining in the ground every 2 seconds through avoided plastics. So that's a pretty big shift as a voluntary commitment by these signatories. Why that's super important is that the leading actors showed policymakers what's possible, and that's informed many of the national roadmaps, and it's now informing the global commitments. The global treaty for plastics that is in process at the moment. And you've got a group of high ambition businesses, a business coalition that's actively trying to inform policy to say these are the things we need to get in place, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's materials design, whether it's financing, etc. So that type of convening and the shape of that commitment was really very deliberate to be able to both drive private sector innovation and inform policy at the same time.
Andrew, you've given us a great example there of the power of voluntary agreements and coordination across players. Aleyn, I'm going to ask you, do you think that's all well and good, but actually time's come for regulation? What role do you see here for regulation to accelerate the move to a more circular economy?
Regulation certainly has its place, and I think, as was referred earlier on, one of the aspects is that it needs to be fair. It needs to ensure that everyone's operating on a level playing field. And many of the companies that we work with actually often actively ask for better regulation and ambitious regulation, as long as everyone else is held to that same standard as well. So I think it is a very powerful driver, and it's something that I think is needed to really sometimes force that internalization of external costs that companies need to take into account and raise the standards. And many times these have significant benefits for consumers, for end customers. Actually, they all really point in that direction, and for society as well. So it definitely has its place, but it's best done in collaboration, I think, with industry, because then you get informed regulation, and you also have industry that is buying into that whole process.
Great. We might come back to that theme of collaboration, but quickly, Aleyn, obviously, clearly governments need to do a lot more to help ensure the conditions are right, the incentives are there, and even, as you mentioned, the regulations there to drive change. But companies don't need to wait for that, do they? They can take action now. Can seem quite overwhelming for some. Where would an individual company start on this journey of reinvention from your perspective?
Yes, so companies really need to be anticipating what's going to happen in the future. I think there are learnings from past discontinuities, whether it's the advent of the internet, over 20 years ago, or others that we've seen since. And currently, we are probably undergoing also another revolution when it comes to AI and the likes. The advantage, however, that companies have is we all know what needs to happen. So we've been forewarned now for a long time, and companies have some time to start putting things into action. And so companies need to think about, well, what needs to happen, and really work back from the endpoint and put in place a strong vision, a strong set of targets. And the challenge really that companies have is to create the business model of tomorrow while still operating the business model of today, and to then manage that transition from one to the other. And it's a huge challenge for companies that are established, as opposed to startups who can start from a blank slate. And so that highlights really the importance of leadership in a company. And we see those companies that have taken a strong stand, or those where the CEO, the senior leadership, is really taking that on board. And then that percolates down into the rest of the organization. One example that I'm sure Andrew will be familiar with as well is that of Philips. Many years ago, took a bold target that I believe they wanted to tie 25% of their revenues to circularity, and that no new products could be sold anymore if they didn't adhere to the company's eco-design principles. And that kind of target is very powerful, because then it gives the permission, or indeed the incentive, for the rest of the organization to fall into place and to start innovating towards that goal. So what companies need to do is effectively, where the external pressure doesn't yet exist, to give themselves that innovative pressure internally. And then, of course, put the resources behind that, bring teams to coalesce around those goals, and every single business unit, every single function within the company then can start aligning behind that.
That's fascinating. So clearly goes far beyond the role of the sustainability team within a company.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The CEO, even the board needs to be leading.
It's a whole organization change that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? I think that the other thing that we've consistently seen over the years is that this is a huge education and learning agenda, because it's a journey that companies are going on, and departments in companies, and different departments in companies are going on. So I think your question about where to start is the point is to start and to treat it as a learning journey. And I think what we've found is that these collaboration platforms, or finding ways to collaborate, pre-competitively and across value chains, is hugely helpful, because there's so many common learning challenges and opportunities that exist through sharing. As everybody transforms, that companies should seek them out, and they should really see this as a fundamental transformation that's going to take many years, and it does touch every part of the organisation, as Aleyn said.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, collaboration seems to come up in every podcast episode we record about innovation, but especially when it comes to the circular economy, and I think especially when it comes to the supply chain of any company that's looking to transform in this way. So, Aleyn, I wonder if you could explain a little bit about why that collaboration with suppliers is so important to business model innovation.
Well, in the context of climate, I think it probably also applies to nature-based impacts as well. The vast majority of the impact, especially in the manufacturing sectors, lies in the supply chain. So whatever change needs to happen has to involve the supply chain in some form or other. Suppliers will right now be geared towards supplying the current incumbent business model. So any company that's trying to change that business model needs to bring on board the suppliers. Where we see a lot of potential and great practice is when companies collaborate with the suppliers, and in many cases, as we know, the nature of the relationship can be quite cost-based, for example. But there's a need to then create a new space to explore new ideas and to look at how shared value can be created. So there's great examples of companies that open up really the process to the suppliers, who actually seek the suppliers for the solutions as well that they may not be able to find on their own, and to co-design, co-create, and co-invest in the process, and then also co-benefit, so to share in the revenue or share in the value that's being created. And we've seen this in different sectors. Certainly in some of the work and the collaborations we're seeing now, for example, in the renewable space and offshore wind, we're looking at companies that are collaborating. I think Andrew was mentioning here pre-competitively. So we have in our current program that we're running at the moment called it's a joint industry program for sustainability in the offshore wind sector. 11 or 12 of the biggest developers in the world are coming together around a common challenge, which is to decarbonize their supply chain, because they realize they need to decouple ultimately to be more resilient. And they're working together to create a set of common standards, ways of increasing transparency in the supply chain for data, and then also to drive the innovation that they see is needed to bring down emissions going forward. So that will be, as Andrew said, it takes time. These will be a multi-year process. But what's really important, I think, is to just accelerate as much as possible. There's no straight journey. It's lots of twists and turns, and you have to learn. So the quicker you learn, the quicker you fail, the more you can actually start driving that change.
So supply chain collaboration, clearly vital. Another really vital piece of this seems to me at least to be consumer engagement. Clearly for a circular economy to become reality, we need consumers to be buying less, sharing more, handing products back to be refurbished, etc. How do we leverage the power of the consumer, Andrew, from your perspective? What do we need to do more and better at that?
Well, at the risk of being controversial, I would say that's not really the problem. The problem is that we need to be innovating to provide people with better product systems solutions that they can access and use that meet a need and are affordable and they're convenient. Because short of policy changes, and policy changes really work. I mean, if you look at the plastic bag 5p charge that was introduced in the UK a few years back, it completely took them off the market in no short order. And the take up of reusable bags by people is just a no-brainer, and people are very, happy to do it. In fact, from what I can see, it's not an issue. But in many cases, we just have to really develop better solutions for people that they can participate in. And packaging is a great example, and the need for an opportunity that reuse represents more broadly. I mean, I think every one of us has got a cupboard full of packaging, fast food takeaway containers and bottoms and tops, and nothing fits together. You open the cupboard, it all falls out. You repack it, and a week later it's a jumbled mess again. I mean, we all experience in our kitchens every single day the dilemma of plastics packaging. And, if we were to do some simple things like put design standards in place and to converge on bottoms and tops that fitted, for example, develop systems where you could return packaging easily and conveniently, as a reverse logistics of Amazon deliveries that take away the packaging with them, or various ways in which you can go to your supermarket and easily refill things, or buy concentrates you can drop into refill bottles, and so there's a lot of innovation that's being developed in that space, but it needs to be pushed harder, and we need to work the problem harder. We need policies and regulations to support it, and not bang on about making people feel guilty and how they should, this is a consumer problem. I mean, the fact that we call people consumers is a problem. And, us around the table here who are a fairly well-educated bunch, we're trapped into this mindset that it's we treat people as consumers and we say it's their problem. It's not really their problem. It's what we put on the market and how we market and we advertise, and the system service solutions that we offer.
Well, let's get on to that system, because it strikes me that we need a system that has a lot more transparency in it now in terms of material flows around the economy. Businesses are going to need to know much more about their use of natural resources. They're going to need to know how their products are made, where they end up, how and where they might be reused or refurbished. And it would be good to discuss how we might create a system like that. Creating a system where material flows are tracked, does that happen at a business level, an industry level, or a city level? What do you think, Andrew?
I think it's all of the above. Increasing transparency is, a huge part of the solution, and I think what's encouraging is that through digital and AI and other transformative technologies, now we are seeing a vast increase in transparency, and that there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in that space. And what we have seen with the global commitment in plastics is we now, for the first time, have the annually reported volumes on market by companies who are participating. They're telling us how much what's the volume of plastics they're producing, how much of it is using recycled content, what are they investing in reuse, how are they actually looking at compostables and other materials innovations. So that's been reported and fully open annually now for the first time. It didn't exist more than 5 years ago, which is remarkable because we've been talking about reduce, reuse and recycle for 40 years. And we only, in the last 5 years, have had the transparency of the signatories of the global commitment to actually talk about what, in fact, they're doing in that space. And I think we need to help people be able to make better choices of the solutions that emerge. And, that spans from everything that we do in terms of advertising, labeling, but also, what we put on our cereal boxes to help people understand the story of their food. I mean, really basic stuff. And, I think there's a combination of regulatory mandated standards and reporting and independent certifications and those things, but it's also the way in which companies can tell their stories as well, because most people in the public don't know what regenerative agriculture actually is, but they do understand that we need to be pro-nature in some way.
Fantastic. Andrew, thank you. We are nearly out of time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you both a final question. What are the 3 things in your daily life that you hope will become more circular in your lifetime? Aleyn, starting with you.
At a personal level, 3 things that I find myself thinking about a lot is firstly, around the food that I buy and that I make for myself, for my family. I think that the food system needs to radically change in the future, not just to reduce the carbon impacts, but also to address the harm to nature and harm to health as well. So I really hope that will be addressed very quickly. The second area, which is a personal pain point of mine, is that I would love my electronic devices to last a lot longer than they currently do. So I certainly hope that will be improving. And thirdly, I must say I am a bit of an online shopper, like perhaps most of us, and also I go to the supermarket a lot to do errands, and packaging is a very big issue that I think needs to be dealt with. Making sure that packaging is not, or things are not overpackaged, but also that it's dealt with in the right way as well. So that's something that I think we all face.
Great, thanks, Ellen. And Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, I'm with Ellen. Food is a big one for me. Plastics packaging, I think, is in the next 20 years, if we don't sort this out, we're in really big trouble. We need to work out, better ways of getting things to people. And so hopefully we can make some real progress on that. I think the third thing for me is actually related to the transformational technology space. We're at this moment where we're seeing an explosion of artificial intelligence possibilities and digital, and I would hope that we see some fundamental breakthroughs in material science, in the ways in which we are able to see transparency and imagine a world where you can go into a supermarket and you point your phone at whatever it is and it tells you exactly where it came from and exactly what's in it and exactly how good it is for you and for the environment and the world.
Andrew, and on that note and vision for the future, a big thank you very much. That's all for episode 3 of Net Zero. What's innovation got to do with it? Big thank you to our guests, Andrew Morlet and Aleyn Smith-Gillespie. I can see huge potential for this more circular world where businesses can thrive and consumers' needs are met, but not at the expense of the planet. And for business leaders too, it all starts with rethinking the very essence of what their business offers.
Yeah, I agree. And we're far off from a fully circular economy, but I think what I took from this discussion is that businesses can implement changes within their own organisation and also beyond that with their suppliers. And those initial steps can already drive quite a big impact.
Absolutely. Well, we've got one final episode left in our series, which means only one more type of innovation to discuss.
Yes, and Andrew actually just picked up on it at the end. We're going to be talking about promising new technological innovations that are emerging to help us reach net zero, and we'll be talking about how we can get those off the ground in time.
I'm really looking forward to that discussion. And if you are too, do follow or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow the Carbon Trust on social media to be the first to hear when it comes out. Until then, thanks very much for listening.